mornings, everyone. I'll call the meeting to order. Thank you, councillors. Welcome, everyone. At the time of the agenda being published, there was no public forum. If we go to the apologies, I have apologies received from Councillor Elder and Councillor Hall, and most likely, at least for lateness, from Councillor Steadman. I'll move that they be accepted. Seconded. Councillor Hawkins. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Item 3, I'll move that the committee confirm the agenda with the following alteration in regard to Standing Order 2.1, that option C be adopted in relation to moving and seconding and speaking to amendments. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Newell. No discussion. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no. That's agreed. And I'll move that the committee notes the elected members' interest register attached at attachment A and confirms the associated management plans. There are no changes intimated anywhere. Seconded by Councillor Newell. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no. That's agreed. Part A reports. First of all, Ms Pinfold and Mr Blair to talk to the non-financial activity report. Thank you, Nicola. Adrian, do you have any comments you'd like to preface, or would you just like to go straight to questions? Right, questions, councillors. Councillor Lord.
Yeah, Mr Blair, just a wee question. With the calls that come into the CSA, so I rang the CSA to make a, because we always get told ring 474 4000, so I rang probably 2.5 months ago to log some potholes that a resident had been on to me about, and I'm just wondering the process, because nothing had been done. I rang again this week and I've had a call back from Transport today saying yes, we've logged that job, and I'm just wondering how the process is that the first call didn't log a job, and the only reason I got a call back was because I specifically asked for it. Which, could you tell me how that might have happened?
Through the chair, without specifics, I can't. I imagine what has happened is that the original call has gone to the appropriate department, and it, for some reason, hasn't been followed through. What I could do is, if you can give me the details, I can follow it up offline and come back to you with the the outcome of what's actually happened.
It's perhaps less about my own situation. I'm just trying to wonder what the process is. So when they log a call about something like that, does it go to Transport, or does it go to the company that would fix that directly? Or I'm trying to find out the process.
No, again, depending on the particular issue, normally it would go straight to the contractor if it was, for example, a transportation issue. Again, depending on the issue, or if it's where a service has not been carried out, it would go to the relevant staff in transportation to follow up and act on. Yes.
Councillor Gary.
Thank you. On page 25, paragraph 31, can you tell us about the pop-up garden?
Through the chair, it's one of the initiatives under Te Aotearoa. It's being fitted out at the moment at the Otago Corrections Facility in a container. It'll be a garden that moves around various communities, sort of on rotation. We've got a number of sites in mind, including the Octagon and a couple of New World car parks, sort of on its initial. On the list for initial locations.
I was just trying to envisage how it would look, how big and how it would look.
Right, so it's a standard shipping container that opens out to provide a covered garden space. We can probably send around some photographs of others elsewhere, because they've used in other cities.
Thank you. Councillor Wiley.
Thank you. Paragraph 13 on page 18 of our paper's building consents. The quarter remains in line at 80.9 million, record number of building consents, peaking at 339 applications. Are you seeing that trend progressing, or the buoyancy or commentary around that?
Through the chair, I'll ask Mr Henderson to answer that question, if that's okay.
Through the chair. Yeah, there's definitely a level of buoyancy. I mean, obviously, we're continuing to see record numbers coming through year on year, and you can see through the graphs of that as well, and mindful of, obviously, the future economic changes coming through to the city as well. So, yeah, very buoyant.
Okay. Just following up in paragraph 14 and talking about the statutory 20 workday timeframes and things like that. Just ensuring the clarity is when you pause the clock, should there be an issue, say after and reviewing it, say 8 days in, you ask for more information, that information comes back to you, you start the clock again, or just because again I'm hearing people talk about it takes 45 days to get a consent and all that type of thing when it should only take 20. So just clarity.
Yep, so through the chair again. So we would normally look at a consent anywhere between, currently between 10 and 15 days. After obviously our colleagues in planning and other areas have looked at it. Depends on the quality of the application that comes through. So if there is a high quality application comes through that can literally get granted immediately, then fantastic. But then sometimes we'll get poor quality applications come through, which at times can require multiple RFI letters come through. Once an RFI is, request for further information is issued, it stops the clock. Once we get all that information back, and assuming all that information is complete, the clock is backdated to the point where the information was received. If it's not fully complete, then the clock remains on stop until all of that information is received. So that's why when people sort of say it can take 8 weeks, part of that challenge is waiting for information to come back. But the actual working days is the 20 working days that we are required to report on. And on average, currently, the average working day is 11 days.
So really it's about the quality of data that you get coming in. If people keep giving you good data and the right information, it's easily knocked off inside the 20 days.
Absolutely,
Yep.
yes.
Perfect, that's what I keep telling them. And so anyway, that's good. Okay, more a question for Ms Pinfold or even for the chair. On paragraph 23 on page 24, can I just get clarification on when did the hearings end on the 2GP? Like when, you talk about deliberations finished, when did the hearings finish?
It's probably best if Anna. Can you hear people here? Anna from over there.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. So last year. Cool. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Question on paragraph 13, following on from Councillor Wiley's. The 339 building consents, I think it was 339. I'm just wondering if that is a measure that is helpful when we talk about activity, when many of those could just be alterations as opposed to new builds. And given what I think Councillor Wiley was talking about was a buoyancy in the market and activity, I'm just wondering whether there's any ability to get reports on new builds as opposed to alterations. And
Through the chair, absolutely. Yeah, we currently collect that data and happy to provide that through to the committee as required.
Thank you. I'll bring that up under matters for the chair.
Thank you. All right, there being no further questions. Sorry, Councillor Lord, my apologies.
I just want to follow up on Andrew's question regarding the building consent, because we were told several years, 3 or 4 years ago at least now, that it was a practice that had historically happened but was no longer happening. I just want to confirm, so when you get a building consent and you look at the consent and there's a number of things you might need to know, you don't just spot the first one, oh look, they haven't got north marked, and then you do all your requests for further information at that one point?
Through the chair. No, there's an initial vetting that's undertaken. So when an application is received, we would get an administration officer to look through that application to see whether or not all the normal things are included within the application, because we don't want to be at day 12 or anything like that asking for that sort of information. So the vetting officer gets that information so that it's pretty much hopefully complete by the time the technical review is undertaken by the processing officer. So there could be multiple RFIs through the process. So we got told specifically by the CEO a couple of years or a few years ago that practice was not happening, and that at the time that a consent was opened and examined, there would be only one request for further information. Now, you would make sure the onus was on the building consent team to make sure that they requested all further things, so that you couldn't, for example, say you need an electrical report or something like that, and by the time they come back, that's given you another 10 days. So that would concern me if that was... So you're saying that's common, that someone might get a multiple number of stoppages? So, again, through the chair, so there is the initial vetting, as mentioned, which is I guess, have they supplied all the required paperwork, fire reports or anything like that? Not a technical review, just to see whether or not they've put the boundaries in, the measurements in, etc. So it's a real basic review. And I say, once all that's information, then a technical review is undertaken, at which point the plumbing and drainage and the building officers will then issue a RFI letter with all the technical aspects that require answering. But
at that point, all deficiencies would be asked to be corrected at the same time.
I can't hand on heart indicate that always. I'd need to go and double check that. I think there are occasions where we do issue 2 letters, one from a plumbing and drainage and one from building, but I would need to just double check that.
All right. But that would be the desired goal?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay. All right, Councillor Gary.
Thank you. Could you just speak to the outsourcing of consenting? Are we still having others outside of our organisation assisting with that?
Yeah, through the chair. Yes, we are.
What proportion of consents would those be?
So, on average, we currently outsource about 4 applications a week.
And what would that proportion be?
So, for a week, we receive so for a week 16 a month, 20 a month, and we receive up to 300 applications a month. So it's a small percentage that we're ultimately working towards stopping.
And so what challenges does that provide you with? Any extra challenges?
There's a lot more administrative work required in, I guess, bundling the information up, because the outsourcing contractors don't have access to our systems like we do. So there is additional work that we have to do to prepare it for them. And then obviously once it comes back, it's got to be, I guess, rebundled back into our systems and databases, etc. So we certainly all agree that we want to stop it. It's just a case of when can we?
And do you have any sense of when that might be?
No.
Thank you for your honesty.
Thank you. Just before we go to the next item, while I've got staff there, I'd just like to make a couple of comments about two matters that are raised in the executive summary. The first one is the progress on the second generation plan. I think it's appropriate, while Ms Pinfold and Dr Johnson are in the room, to acknowledge the progress that's been made. It's been an extraordinary effort, and I think we should acknowledge the staff workload involved in that. We would all hope that it will be a fine document that will stand the test of time, but I think it's appropriate that we say thank you formally to people for that. The other matter where I think some considerable praise is also needed is in respect to the second of the items in paragraph 4, and the successful obtaining of the grant from the first grant from the Provincial Growth Fund for the feasibility work that councillors were briefed on yesterday. And in particular, I think there's considerable acknowledgement necessary to Ms Pinfold and Ms Graham for the work in particular around, and Dr Bidrose indeed as well, for the work that has got us to this point. So on behalf of everyone, thank you very much to those parties concerned. And seeing we had so much trouble by passing anything by acclamation last time, we won't bother. We'll just say thank you very much. All right, thank you. That takes us, I'll move that the report be noted. Seconded by Councillor Hawkins. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no. That's agreed, and that takes us to item 6, the draft National Planning Standards. Dr Johnson. Now, there's an amendment, isn't there? Have you got the amendment? There's a change line. I'll ask Anna to make any initial comments, and then we'll go to questions. And just to explain, in the mayor's, there are a couple of typos that you will have noticed, and we'll let the mayor sign his name rather than Mayor Cull in the draft. But there's also an amendment which we'll get to in due course, that this has been a matter that's had to change quickly. So I'll come to that in due course. But first of all, Anna, you want to make any initial comment in addition to the report? Explain the background to elected members?
Yes, sure. So the development of the National Planning Standard has been going on for quite a while now, and this is, I guess, the culmination of that process in terms of a formal submission. But we've had input along the way as what they called a pilot council. So they would send ideas around different parts of the standard to a group of councils to get some feedback. And we've taken every opportunity that we've had to help the ministry with feedback and explaining how different proposed ideas may or may not work from our point of view, both in terms of a professional perspective on that as planners, I guess a peer review function, as well as explaining what the impact may be for Dunedin and our plan. So I think overall the consultation process has been pretty good on this compared to some other national initiatives where things seem quite rushed. However, I guess we've gotten to the thin edge of the wedge, and they have to decide what's going to go into the standard. And while we're really appreciative of the consultation process that they have used, I think the final outcome is probably not going to work particularly well for Dunedin. And having read several other authorities' submissions, I think we're reflecting a pretty common theme across all the ones that I've read, certainly around Otago, and I've had a look through Auckland's submission as well. And I think it's an incredibly challenging thing that they've tried to do in terms of setting up a national planning standard. I think the intentions were very good. However, the practical realities of it, I think, mean that the costs to communities in terms of having to redo their plans at a very awkward time, given that most councils are just finished or just about to finish their second generation plans, is really probably not going to outweigh the benefits aren't going to outweigh those costs. And also standardizing, things from Gore District Council to Auckland City Council in terms of a plan structure that's going to work equally well for both types of authorities is incredibly challenging. So we've outlined those concerns in here. I think the concerns do reflect a very shared perspective. I think certainly for the smaller councils like Gore and Waitaki, this could be a good thing. Mackenzie, councils that have one planner, having a standard to work to would probably benefit them. For us and a city the size of Dunedin, I think it would be quite a costly exercise for us to have to go through the whole second generation plan process again. And
certainly staff aren't keen, and I suspect a lot of the community that have spent a lot of money participating in this process and time are probably not keen to do it again any sooner than they need to. So that's what the submission says.
And just to add to the context, there has been considerable exchange of correspondence between myself and the Minister as we've worked our way through those concerns. And as Dr Johnson said, staff have been involved in trying to adequately express the concerns and the cost implications, and I think there has been quite a shift. What comes out of it remains to be seen, but the submission is pretty clear. Questions, councillors? Councillor Wilson.
Sorry, my computer's just died on me, but the provision about under question 4, 5 and 6, I think you've raised an issue with rural residential, and I just wanted to clarify that you don't want it residential zone, but equally you don't want it as a rural zone, equally you don't want it as an urban zone or residential zone, I presume. And I wasn't sure that they had quite the same clarity.
Sure. What Councillor Wilson's referring to is we provided comment on the chapter structure and how well it reflected the 2GP structure and how difficult it would be to transition. So one of the things that we commented on was that the planning standard does not have a separate rural residential section. It has rural residential as a type of rural zone. And because of the scope of work involved in moving, combining two sections and the implications of that, we commented on that. But we certainly weren't implying that we thought rural residential should be a type of urban zone. It was more saying that the structure differed from ours in that respect, and there would be a bit of work involved in changing it. It wouldn't necessarily change over well.
Okay. Further questions?
The other question that came to my mind when they did the presentation the other day was about the use of the map and I don't want to reflect 2GP, but I will reflect on the developers coming along and talking about infrastructure and their lack of knowledge. And it occurred to me that one of the benefits of the map that they talk about is trying to integrate what may be in the infrastructure, mapping the infrastructure on to the district plan or having a link to that. And our council's quite good on that. It does have a wastewater services map online. It doesn't have what's in the 10-year plan online, regrettably. And I'm just wondering whether that was one thing that you'd see some benefits in showing what is there and what capacity is available.
Well, having read the standard, I'm not sure which aspect you're referring to, but to answer your question just more broadly, whether it would be helpful to have electronic maps of infrastructure and capacity available to the public, most certainly. The more information that you can give the community to help them understand what they can and cannot do is certainly a good thing, yeah.
Well, yeah, and I thought that was one thing that I was interested in seeing how that might be a direction or a layer that was added on to give that nuance, and whether you'd be happy if that was part of our submission.
Yeah, we can certainly look at adding that, and maybe offline you can sort of give me some words around that. Yeah, I would support that.
Councillor Garrow.
Thank you. I had a question around page 157 under question 17, the acronyms and codes. And I wondered, I was first of all very pleased to see that in the comments around the need for the plan to be written in plain English and the public-facing version of the e-plan to have a smaller number of acronyms as possible. But I just wanted to ask you, is that currently a problem from the community feedback that you've had in the past?
Well, I think this standard and our plan are designed to be e-plans, and they're really used most easily in electronic format. So certainly, in terms of the 2GP, if you're using it electronically or this standard and you have an acronym and that acronym allows you just to click on the acronym and instantly see the full word, I don't think it's as problematic to have acronyms. However, if for some people they can't use the plan electronically, it can be problematic. And so there's always a balance between having something that keeps it shorter and less wordy, but you have to be mindful that people will be using it. Some people will always use a hard copy. So, you know, I think it can be an issue when you start to use a lot of acronyms because you're reliant on people using the document in an electronic form.
Thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
And I guess when I was going through this one, it was difficult to stay awake and read it at the same time, but because it has that effect. But also, you made the comment, I'm trying to quote this: the final outcome not good for Dunedin. Can you just expand on that? Did you say again that's what you intended to say, or?
Well, when we evaluated the standard and what its benefits and costs might be, a big thing is, you know, obviously there's a cost to council in preparing a full plan review, and which is not insignificant, which is shared by ratepayers. But you know, you can almost double that figure when you consider the costs of all the community participants in the process. And so I think. And something being not good for Dunedin, what I'm reflecting is that there's a cost to people in terms of time and actual financial costs, and even just the effort. You know, a lot of people do this in their spare time at night, writing submissions, and they don't necessarily want to go through the whole process again. So that's one major concern with the standard. The second major concern is it's trying to create a one-size-fits-all for the entire country, so from Gore to Auckland, and it's probably pitched at about a Timaru, basically. You know, those smaller councils are dragging it down towards the simple end, and so if a community wants really nuanced planning provisions that reflect, you know, special character or special concerns of that community, when you try to fit it into that one size, you know, Timaru-sized plan, you lose the ability to write things in a way that best tries to reflect what everyone wants, and that's really what planning's about. And so you're kind of forced to put a square peg into a round hole, and it could either be quite difficult to read and understand because it's a bit forced, or it just cannot be drafted. You just cannot draft it in the way that the community wants, and so there's a loss of democracy from my point of view. And I think those are the two biggest concerns, and why the standard would work probably quite well for the smaller councils, but not so much for the larger councils, because you lose that ability to be responsive to what people want.
Okay. And are your colleagues and peers in similar sized cities, you know, say 60,000 plus, are they submitting in the similar way that we are on this?
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read everyone's submission, but I certainly have heard from all the other Otago planning managers. It's been discussed at the regional planning managers meetings, and I've looked, we've all sent each other submissions around to share. So I've certainly seen those. I did look up Auckland's one just out of curiosity, because our plan was modeled to a degree on theirs, because at the time of starting the 2GP process, this planning standards was sort of on the horizon. It was sort of a murmur, and so we thought, well, we're better to follow Auckland's model, because if they're going to make a planning standard, it would likely follow that format. As it turns out, that was a bad guess, because the planning standard doesn't reflect the Auckland format very well at all either, and their submission seems to indicate very, very similar concerns. And Local Government New Zealand will also be making a submission, and they sent around a draft of that to their subscription list, and I have had a look at that, and it, you know, same exact things that we're saying in that one as well.
Okay, so the sense I'm getting is there is very much common threads from cities with 60,000 plus population submitting on the same values or same points that we are.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
I'm going to pick up probably somewhat similar, and that's around the zones and the colour palettes that were used. and defining, I was struck that when that roadshow came through, they said that you could internally decide what is a high-density residential or a medium-density residential, and there wasn't an external standard. So am I right in saying then that effectively, and I think they actually used the example, Oamaru might decide that a medium residential is this, and Auckland might decide it's this, so therefore each territorial authority can come up with its own definition, and then we'll end up using the same term, which you've highlighted in your submission as saying that it could cause confusion if looking at two district plans next to each other. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, well, that's what they clarified when they came down. That you have a set number of zones that you're allowed to use, but there's no requirement to use them to mean the same thing. And somebody asked at the meeting, so, in high density in Auckland could be, a 5-story apartment. In Oamaru, it's like a 500 square meter section, which might, and that would be okay. And so someone else at that meeting made the comment that it sort of defeats the purpose of standardization if the meaning can differ so much. And yes, we've included that in the submission because that seemed to be a commonly shared kind of concern.
Councillor Hawkins. Oh, sorry, but another one?
Well, yeah, it's more like a comment on the end of that, which is obviously then if you are having those maps put out in E-plans and two maps touch each other, then the colours could mean completely different things across that boundary line.
Yeah. Councillor Hawkins.
Indeed, yeah, thank you. My question's really around preparation time. So, for how long were staff preparing the full review of the district plan that we're currently doing up before it was notified? How long was that process?
Through the chair. It's a bit of a how long's a piece of string type of question because it's hard to determine where the start date is. I guess some of you may recall we started with the spatial plan, which was really about starting the conversation with the community about how the city should look into the future. So that isn't technically part of the 2GP plan review, but it was really the strategic scene setting, and that was finished in 2010, I think it was. It was. It's been a very long time, and at the same time, while that was going on, the planners were starting to do their initial investigations around that plan review process, which generally looks at consents data, and we collect a spreadsheet of comments that have been made about the plan, and starting to explore some of those issues. So, certainly, I'd say we started that initial review around that 2009. Mark, roughly?
So is it possible if we only have 7 years to notify the next one that review process will have to start before the current 2GP is even operative? I mean, because obviously there's an appeals process and we don't know how long it's going to be before it's going to be operative. But we have to, under the proposal, we'll need to have notified the next one 7 years from it being gazetted or whatever the process is.
Oh yeah, it's it's a scary proposition, really. I don't know how to describe it otherwise, because the appeals will take a few years. They took a lot longer last time, but I think the Environment Court has sort of improved their processes, so they do move much quicker than they did the first generation plan years. But nevertheless, the plan will be evolving through that appeal process. There's also a sort of a queue of future plan change ideas. Things just didn't quite get into the 2GP in terms of the time frame that we had. Those will be going on, and so how you then start to create a new plan based on a fundamentally different form and structure and style at the same time that you're trying to finish off another one, I can't even imagine how to coordinate that yet, but it would be extremely difficult.
Thank you. Well, I think that probably illustrates the difficult situation we're in and the need for these submissions to be persuasive and strongly argued both by authorities like ourselves and LGNZ. Mr. President. Councillor Wilson.
Well, it does come down to the cost ramifications, and I'm just wondering whether we should give some idea of that cost, because this is the standardisation to be required would be at presumably the ratepayers' costs with potentially no benefit. And
Well,
that seems
one of the first communications that I had with Minister Parker was in respect of exactly that, namely the cost both in terms of actual expenditure and staff time and commissioner time and other identifiable costs to that point, which was 2 months ago or such. And I think that was a surprise to him, the magnitude of that. In due course, that's something that we'll be able to report to all of you and the community and quantify more fully so that government understands that the sunk cost involved in the process that we are currently bringing to an end. And the last thing that they would want, I assume, is to see any or all of that wasted, just as we would think that would be extremely unproductive. So, right, can we go to, Wendy, can you put up the extra sentence that the staff would like to add to the submission, please? Do you want to talk to this, please, Anna?
Yeah, so we had this in the draft submission initially, but then we were asked a question about it, and how it turns out is there was the standard itself, which you've had attached, but there was also sort of a introductory discussion document that was put out at the same time, and that introductory discussion, a companion document, talked about the need to have hyperlinks between district and regional plan provisions, and this came up during that session when Ministry for the Environment came down. There was a question from, I think, a regional council person that was there saying, well, how could this work? Because essentially we would be required to track the regional plan changes and constantly be up to date, and potentially exposing ourselves to some legal liability of having the wrong information in our plan. But I received a question on this earlier, and I couldn't actually find it in the standard, so I took it back out. And the reason we couldn't find it in the standard is because it's explained in the other document, and there's a very vague sentence in the standard itself which doesn't seem to indicate this requirement, but the other document seems to indicate that it will be a requirement. So it's a bit of an uncertain area in terms of what they're expecting around here, but suggesting we just add it. Well, we actually contacted the ministry to say what's proposed here, and they actually asked us to put it back into the submission because they said they agreed themselves it's not entirely clear what the requirement is. So basically this is saying we oppose having to provide a hyperlink to regional plan provisions, and the reason being that we don't want to take on the responsibility that they're incorrect and that we give people the wrong information about another council's rules.
So just on that, so that relates to the question that Councillor Gary asked earlier, really in terms of e-plan accessibility, depending on the hardware that people have and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about the hardware. It's really just about the fact that we would then have to be responsible to ensure all those hyperlinks are accurate and up to date all the time, because we could be giving people incorrect information, and then they don't realize they need a consent, and then they blame us.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'll come to you in a second. I'll move the approval of the submission, including that those paragraphs. That's seconded by Councillor Newell. You have another question, Councillor Lord?
Yeah, well, it was just in relation to that. Would hyperlinks, if thinking about that, I think of some of the situations where DCC have consented housing development in areas where it's been directly contrary, say for example to what the regional council would suggest in floodplains and that sort of thing. And would hyperlinks, could they be done in such a way, or would that join up the parts of the plan so that those problems would be avoided? I mean, even for us, the risk is that we will consent somewhere that's not an appropriate place to build.
I'm concerned that there's a suggestion there that we've done some of those. I'm not quite sure that I can think of any. Karitani being a case that went to Environment Court about it.
Try looking down Riccarton Road.
Well, I can answer the question. I'm not going to talk about that particular example, but certainly what we have done in the 2GP is to include what's called a note to plan user, and it alerts people to where other requirements must be met, but it doesn't actually say what those requirements are. So it includes links to things, bylaws, regional plan rules. So we'd say, you may need to check the regional plan because you may need a consent to discharge, but it doesn't say what the rule actually is. And we certainly support and would happily provide any content to any other legal requirements that people have, just to alert them to them. But we don't want to have to take on the responsibility of saying exactly what those bylaws or other rules state, because I think that puts us in a vulnerable position if we get that information wrong or it becomes out of date.
Okay, I think that's clear. Councillor Wilson.
Well, I quite like the way this is worded, and I presume that's also worded that you don't think the regional council would be able to necessarily keep up to date with what our rules are. I presume there's a two-way. Yeah, but it also, when I looked at it from a regional council plan perspective, I thought it would be particularly difficult to read a regional plan if it referred to 5 different councils' plans as well, potentially. So the readability would, yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole lot of reasons, but readability also would become impractical. Yeah.
All right, any further questions? Councillor O'Malley.
Just looking at the wording there, though, it also seems to imply at this point that you don't want to have any hyperlinks at all. Or is it that you don't want to be obliged to put hyperlinks in, and the reason you don't want to be obliged to is that you're exposing yourself to legal challenges later? Should we expand it a little bit to say why it is that you're doing the opposition, so that the reason I'd say that is because you're going back, you're submitting, and what you really want is the idea carried through that this could be significant legal exposure if it became a mandatory obligation. So I'm just wondering if the sentence could be made a little bit bigger to explain why.
I think that's a fair point. I don't want to get into writing it now, but I'm happy to entertain the understanding that that statement in red will be expanded with the rationale that's been presented to us, if people are happy with that. All right, any further discussion? Well, I think we're now in discussion. Councillor Wilson will have a last question first.
Oh, well, your motion is that we leave it as, and I had raised that issue of the mapping. And I look at Central Otago District Council, for example, at the moment, not using our own council, where there are issues about where development can happen because there isn't any clarity to that. And I think if one is looking at what is the benefits of getting some changes in the templates or what information ratepayers want to know, I don't think it's about having the same colours, but I think it is about people having information accessible to them, and that's where the map could be better and better utilised, that councils should be providing to their data in a way that is electronic for the mapping of infrastructure and the capacity. And so if I'm in the head space of what are we trying to do here and to make it better for the ratepayers, I actually think there's some stuff there that could be put into the submission about the information quality and it going deeper. So that's why I raised that question earlier. You've put the motion that it is.
Well, perhaps, I mean, it's a further matter, isn't it? So perhaps you need to draft something and send it to Wendy, and we'll look at that once we've dealt with this matter. We are now in a discussion which is the approval of the submission with the addition of an expanded version of these paragraphs. And in due course, Councillor Wilson's going to present a further amendment. But are there any other speakers to the submission or this at this point? Mayor Cull.
Okay, well, look, I'm pleased that this submission doesn't confine itself to the technical details. I'm pleased that it grapples with the overarching inadequacies and disadvantages of the standardised approach that MFE have taken. I mean, if different councils can have different definitions, immediately it's not standardised in any case. But the overarching thing here is that prescriptive national standards cannot enable localised placemaking, decision-making and planning. I think that's the principle that this submission speaks to and grasps. And it's ironic to me that at the same time as the government is hastily, for very good reason, introducing an urban development authority proposal to cut through all of the hurdles and challenges that the inconsistencies between the RMA and the Local Government Act and the Land Transport Act throw up, that MFE are coming up with a standardised approach that seems to make the whole damn thing worse. We already have, as someone's alluded, I think Councillor Lord alluded, to the fact that the Environment Court's overriding TLAs when they say, well, this is a risky area, you're not going to develop there. We've already got the Environment Court overruling us and allowing developers to put developments in places that they oughtn't to and that we think they oughtn't to. So, look, frankly, the big picture is that it's to be hoped that MFE will listen to all of the submissions, including this one, around the country, and go back to the drawing board. I think we'll set this. At the moment, what's happening, as I say, with the government's efforts around the need for, we know, residential development around the country, desperately needed residential development around the country. This is just going to put a whole lot of workload onto councils and clog them up when we should just be getting on and getting development done consistent with visions that we've developed in our various and respective spatial plans. And I think that if this is imposed, if MFE ignores, if the government ignores the submissions from around the country, they're going to have a massive and expensive battle on their hands with the local government sector in general, and we all pay the price of that. So it's to be hoped they listen.
Thank you. Further speakers? Have you got the... Can we have a look at what Councillor Wilson's suggesting, please?
Can I ask Anna to confirm that it makes some sense to her? She did say she'd like to have an offline discussion about it. Should be an issue. Apologies to the pedants.
Subject to the odd tidy up, obvious tidy up. Are you happy with that, Dr. Johnson? All right. Okay, so that is included. You're moving that in addition, your seconder somewhere, Councillor Hawkins. We'll just, do you want to deal with that separately, or we can say this is part of the submission? You're happy to throw it all into one big bucket? All right, further speakers? All right, there appear to be none. I don't wish my right of reply. I think the Mayor has articulated the concerns that we have and the issue around the implications for this city at the point we are with a very extensive, much less expensive than Christchurch, but nonetheless extensive and expensive process is most unfortunate. And let's hope the prediction of the Ministry for the Environment seeing sense about this matter comes true. I'll put it, those in favour please say aye. Aye. Against no. That's agreed. That takes us to item 7 on the agenda, items for consideration. Anyone wish to raise anything else? Councillor Lord.
Yeah, I just wonder if it doesn't have to come back in the form of a report, but if we could just have some feedback from the Chief about the matter I raised earlier about building consents. We've been told quite clearly in the past that the habit of not getting all the information and having
we can get a further report on that.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Just in light of the comments made by Councillor Wiley and questioning the 339 building consents, and again, I accept that I have a feeling that they are good news, but I don't think that the 339 building consent applications probably do the news justice, and that we don't know if they're alterations or whether they're new builds or whether they're commercial or housing. And I do think it'd be interesting to have the building consent figures pared down better, and whether you'd consider a different way of reporting on those that may give a better or worse story, but
Yeah,
let's know what the true facts are.
I think that will be helpful, and we could do that by just asking staff to
Break down those accounts.
to
Yeah.
separate the different
Yeah.
consents.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. That's the end of the meeting. Have a productive afternoon. I'll declare the meeting closed.